This is dawn on a frigidly cold morning, and the frost is clinging to the ramparts of Maiden Castle. You know, people often accuse us of being in too much of a hurry in these episodes, to which I say, us? We blitzed 18 Hillforts in a single day dawn to dusk guys? Surely not. But hey, I'm just enjoying having this running. It's definitely easier to enjoy this while cutting this together in my warm lounge than it was the actual morning where I'd got a 6 a.m. train and was borderline losing fingers trying to get these shots. We concluded our journey here last time, but we didn't have time to properly tell its story. While no one who gathered here or lived here ever left us a written account, we have several stages of the story, events which will become increasingly familiar the more we explore other Hillforts. Well, switching to daytime for a moment, the story here begins in the Neolithic. The earliest phase is buried beneath the rework ground of later generations modifying the space, but it began as what is known as a causewayed enclosure. These are roughly circular spaces cut into the earth with multiple walkways you can use to access the interior. And the landscape around Maiden Castle is full of barrows of various sizes and surviving in various states. But based on the archaeology, during the late Bronze Age there's not much happening on the hilltop, but this changes around the early Iron Age. Sometime around 600 BC, the site is transformed into a modest enclosure, but occupation picks up considerably. By the mid-Iron Age, the space in what is now the eastern end of the hill was proving too small, and the settlement nearly tripled in size, and the vast, multi-layered ramparts were cut, though it was a process that would have taken decades. There's also signs that dwellings within the interior were reorganised into straighter lines. Meanwhile, in the surrounding countryside, what had been a scatter of farmsteads and field systems in the Bronze Age suddenly go quiet. It appears that practically all the activity in the surrounding countryside has been drawn into this hilltop location. Even Chalbury, a substantial site to the south, appears to go out of use, and while Poundbury to the north retains some occupation, it appears to mainly be as an auxiliary site to Maiden. However, in a dramatic reversal, by the late Iron Age, around 100 BC, Maiden Castle is losing its significance and its inhabitants. It's not entirely clear where they went. It's been suggested there may have been an oppidum on the site of where the Romans would go on to construct Dorchester, but we've not really found sufficient evidence to confirm that in the archaeology. There is a large site being excavated to the east which lacks the dramatic ditch and banks of Maiden, but has settlement over a much wider area. That may have been where the focus of settlement shifted. Now, if all of that raises some pretty massive questions, well, good, that means you're paying attention. We've got a fair bit to cover. So after the last two episodes going over the single day where we tried to speedrun as many of Dorset's Hillforts, it's left to this follow-up episode to try and pick up the pieces and maybe add a little bit more nuance to some of the places we raced through. But the deeper I've got into this material, this has turned out to be much less kicking the can down the road, more than firing the can down a crowded freeway out of a railgun. Thing is, this episode has been through a lot of redrafts. There is simultaneously a lot of information, but that information itself needs quite a lot of buttressing and additional context, so the complexity quickly radiates out in this fractal pattern where you keep needing to add context to make your context make sense. And I certainly don't want to use the, I'm not a career historian as a shield, because of course we're trying to make the best go of this as we can, and we're no greater or lesser than the sources we're relying on, so as long as I'm not making unsubstantiated claims, this should be doable. But it's just the nature of the topic. A level of uncertainty about many aspects we're going to cover is a feature, not a bug. Just an aside here. Actual archaeologists working in the field are invariably extremely humble and will be the first to tell you when we're uncertain on a piece of evidence or all the various ways that the picture we're trying to piece together is incomplete. The difference is that they are not only used to, but completely at ease with the idea that we are working with incomplete evidence. Always. It's reply guys in Facebook comment sections that are the ones who feel the need to write an all-caps, 3-paragraph mini-novel to try and be the smartest voice in the room. But it betrays an amusing insecurity, but as well as the need to be right, the belief that history should be solved, like a murder mystery where some super intellect can come along and solve any puzzle we have. You know, I may need to get this embossed on something. We don't really have merch at the moment, but history is not Agatha Christie, you are not owed a satisfying conclusion to a particular line of inquiry. This is doubly true of prehistory. We work with what we have, and as you'll see, considering we're going back thousands of years, it's actually quite impressive what we've been able to piece together with what is often just a few scraps. But what's exciting, the picture of Iron Age Dorset really is actively expanding. We are seeing real breakthroughs in our lifetimes. Previous theories from the early 20th century have been overturned in just the last few decades, some of which we'll discuss later. But we mentioned Miles Russell and the Durotriges project. Not only are excavations ongoing year on year, but we really are expanding our understanding of the period. Just one example, a major publication from Miles and others this year, and a lot of you may have seen this, through DNA analysis, it was confirmed that it was men who were moving to new areas to marry women, not women being sent off. And it speaks to the potential of women both holding land and wielding power. We already had hints of this thanks to Roman sources about figures like Boudica or Cartimandua, powerful women who are leading armies. So we are absolutely expanding on our understanding of the era despite the Iron Age Britons not writing anything down themselves. We are piecing together more and more of their world. But okay, as a bit of a newbie to all of this myself, we've been filming Hillforts for a little while now, but it's only recently I've been putting in a bit more academic rigour and a lot more reading. My hope is that I can use my relative inexperience and the journey I've been on getting my head around this as a way in for others for what can at times be a complicated topic. If you're watching and you're someone who has a high level of familiarity with the subject of the Dorset Iron Age, hi! Trying to get this as precise as I can based on the sources we have. Obviously, this is both written by someone who's comparatively new to the field, but also, we're trying to make this accessible to a wider audience, so I hope you'll be patient with us. Okay, well, parenthesis over. The question is then... Despite zigzagging all over Dorset and beyond last time, I realise you may not be much further along in understanding the area. I forget, but in researching this, one thing that's made the job infinitely easier is that when these places are mentioned in a text, I have a pretty good visual reference for what and where they're referring. But I've been exploring and photographing Dorset for around 15 years now, even longer than we've specifically been interested in Hillforts, so I feel a quick geographical rundown of the area may be in order. Well, if we start with Bournemouth, that's where we're based, the town itself was an entirely empty heath even before the 1800s, never mind the 800s BC. But the modern boundaries of the county of Dorset are not wholly irrelevant to our story. To the east, with what is now Christchurch, it's the confluence of the Stour and Avon rivers just before they flow into the sea at Christchurch Harbour and Hengistbury Head. The Avon and surrounding floodplains do appear to have formed a natural frontier to the east, helped by much of the land in what is now the New Forest being quite poor soil for farming, creating something of a buffer zone. If we follow the scoop of the bay west, we get to what is now Sandbanks, an extended spit of land that is separated from Purbeck only by a comparatively short stretch of water, but this is the only inlet into Poole Harbour. Among the largest natural harbours in the world, to the south of here, the confusingly titled Isle of Purbeck, which is primarily a double ridgeline that runs east-west, which could scarcely be less of an island if it were located in the centre of a landlocked desert. Yeah. Few things are quite as well attached to the mainland as the Isle of Purbeck, but hey, look, I'm not the Lord Mayor of naming stuff, so its southernmost extent is the spectacular Jurassic Coast. This itself is a geography field trip, something you can see very plainly from St Aldham's Head, as first the Portland stone of the head gives way to the shale of Kimmeridge, itself followed by the limestone of Brandy Bay, then the chalk of Warbarrow, and within this stretch, perhaps the Jurassic Coast's most famous site at Durdle Door. Then the bay heads south until it meets the Isle of Portland. Portland is still drivable from the mainland, but maintains a much better claim at actually being an island. To the west, Chesil Beach is a prolonged pebble beach that goes for 18 miles, overlooked by Abbotsbury Camp, until you reach West Bay and the town of Bridport. From there, the coast only gets more dramatic, rising to the Golden Cap, the highest point on the south coast, and as far as modern Dorset, you've then got Lyme Regis, just before you then hit Devon. However, as spectacular and varied as this coastline is, it doesn't play as major a role in our account as the topography inland. I mean, for example, there's a lot of significant archaeology that's been done in Purbeck, but as far as the Iron Age, these are not sites that leave any significant trace on the surface. So, getting inland, this is where Dorset becomes harder to describe in simple terms. Where we just got to in the west, you are getting this hilly landscape that defies easy characterization. just a heads up, something that's been a major source for this episode is this by Martin Papworth. It has this diagram of the geology across Dorset, and I could be a pint of espresso deep and still not make good sense of this. I mean, my history credentials may be minimal, but my geology awareness is, well, yes, anyway. So at this point, to make more sense of the geography, it's going to be helpful to overlay the Durotrigean sites that we know about. So modern Dorset does not have a significant natural landmark to determine its boundary to the west, and similarly, in prehistory, it's possible the Axe River delineated the extent of Durotrigean territory. Truthfully, we don't have many pottery finds this way anyway, so it's a little fuzzy where exactly the effective Durotrigean control may have extended. However, as we get north, the pair of Lambert's Castle and Coney's Castle, then onwards to Pilsdon Pen, before heading a little further and the large settlement around Ham Hill. Just pausing here for a moment. Quick backstory, and it is amusing to think that just a handful of years ago, if you mentioned Wikipedia, you'd generally be considered a bit of a filthy casual in any sort of intellectual discipline, but seeing just how much AI and large language models are poisoning the well when it comes to verifiable information, suddenly, what's this? A commitment to sources on an egalitarian platform available free for everyone that actually represents millions of hours of people entering and verifying information, and that doesn't need us to boil the oceans to create a JPEG? Added to the fact that right-wing ghouls hate it. Suddenly, Wikipedia looks pretty great, actually. It's a good first place to look, and as a concise introduction to a topic, it then gives you some pretty good ideas of where you could look next. Anyway, a long time ago, I flicked to the Durotriges wiki, and it contained a map, this map, in fact. And I couldn't help but notice that outside of the Dorset area was this rather conspicuous cone, reaching all the way to the Bristol Channel, and I thought, I wonder what the backstory with that is. It wasn't immediately apparent what that would be referring to. I wasn't aware of any sort of Hillfort sites in that particular area, so I didn't go down the rabbit hole at the time, but it turns out, yes, this is in reference to coin finds and what appears to be later Durotrigean expansion to control a corridor to the Bristol Channel. Now, this is something of a late development, believed to be maybe just a couple of decades before the Roman conquest of AD 43. This is specifically between the rivers Brew, which passes by Glastonbury, and Parrot further south. It's a good reminder that not only were these boundaries highly porous and based on shifting alliances and agreements with people, but while the Hillforts do peg a somewhat more permanent stamp on the territory, we do well not to think of these regions as entirely unchanging. In this northern area, both Ham Hill and Cadbury were major power centres, more on them later. As we wheel around east, we get to some areas that are not Hillforts per se, but are still of interest to the discussion. The landscape of Cranbourne Chase, particularly northeast of Blandford, is pretty rich in prehistory. While it's not as clear in the landscape as most of the Hillforts we've been highlighting so far, there was a major settlement around the Gussage Down area. There are some ditches which may have been part of the settlement there. A little further northeast, and the Bockerley Dyke is kind of unique. It's an Iron Age fortification that, still for a stretch, marks the modern boundary of Dorset. If you look at the settlement type on each side, you see differences in the shape that people are building. Yeah, hard not to see that as evidence of two different people groups. And then a little further over we hit the Avon River. Now, just to complete the tour a moment, swinging back into the interior in this northern area, this is the Blackmore Vale. You have the twin giants of Hambledon Hill and Hod Hill. The much smaller Rawlsbury is a little way west, then heading due south from there you have a few Hillforts less well preserved than the ones we've discussed so far. More on them near the end, and then travelling west you have the Dorchester cluster of Poundbury to the north, Chalbury to the south, and Maiden Castle in the centre. Oh, and to complete the picture, Egerton and Chilcombe are a short way west of there. Now, with that done, we keep mentioning the Durotriges, but we haven't yet established how this extremely diverse group of sites can be determined to be part of an identifiable tribal grouping. It's not unreasonable to assume that a major river or things like that would form boundaries between people groups, but we do have a little bit more to go on than just that. Coin finds are a pretty major factor in determining areas of influence, but coinage in southern Britain is quite a late development. It's another influence from the continent, and you can tell this as it's adopted first by the tribes in the zone closest to the continent, centred around Kent, whereas tribes further away from there, not at all, as it turns out. And based on the distribution of Durotrigean coins, when compared to the Atrebates to the east and the Dabuni to the north, you do get an impression of the extent of these groups. There's more though. To keep it brief, There is a type of pottery that appears to be being produced around Poole Harbour and kind of in the Purbex. Pottery, of course, is a mainstay of archaeology because it's durable in the soil, it's highly individualised, you can often link it back to certain types of clay that are being used, and it's sensitive to changing trends. In the Hillforts that have undergone thorough archaeological investigations, at the early Iron Age levels there's a variety of sources, and then gradually Poole Harbour pottery increases in proportion till the late Iron Age. It's being used almost exclusively, to the exclusion of any other sources of pottery, including much more local sources. And when you start seeing this sequence at multiple sites, it's impossible to see this as just an accident. This is surprisingly centralised. I mean, you take somewhere like Cadbury, that's pretty far from Poole Harbour, and it sort of suggests that this was part of a system that was maybe being enforced. Now, taking a broader view, it is worth pointing out that the early Iron Age was quite a drastic change in the British landscape. In the Bronze Age, the dead are being venerated with barrows, many of which are still plainly visible, and the dead are also being buried with various goods, some of which we'd still consider to be pretty precious. This lozenge, for example, excavated from a barrow a few hundred yards of what is now Maiden Castle. But the early Iron Age, certainly in Dorset, we see that gold and other precious materials virtually vanish in the archaeology. Whatever the people there were doing, it involved a serious change in what was considered valuable. Based on the number of storage pits found in early to mid-Iron Age sites, it's been suggested that grain surplus might have been far more of a status symbol in the early Iron Age than the other materials we associate with, like Bronze Age burials. We do also see these, what are known as currency bars. It's not hard to see that the raw commodity of iron itself was of considerable value, so not surprising that these would be passed around. But yeah, barely any gold at these levels. So we need to keep an eye on the fact that a lot of things from the early to mid-Iron Age are not likely to be the star finds in museums. They can be much more prosaic, and there can be a bit of a selection bias. They're much less likely to grab our attention than, oh my goodness, look at all this Bronze Age gold. Meanwhile, in various places, what had been a series of farmsteads and minor settlements scattered around the landscape change quite suddenly, and the focus of settlement all coalesces around a major hill fort. Both at Maiden and Cadbury and several others, you see the scatter of settlements in the surrounding area disappear for several centuries. However, for all the things that these different parts have in common, there are also quite considerable differences from region to region, so it may do well for us to explore in great depth some of the sites we otherwise breezed through last time. Well, we've already done a sequence at Maiden Castle. Heading west, we only mentioned Pilsdon Pen briefly in passing, which is a shame because it's a great site. This western Dorset area is a bit of an enigma regarding how it fits into the sort of Durotrigian sphere. From 1964, Pilsdon was excavated by Peter Gelling, who uncovered a series of roundhouses, but comparatively little datable material was coming up. So while elsewhere we have this Poole Harbour pottery, which, yes, spikes in popularity, particularly in the late Iron Age, almost to the exclusion of other types, at Pilsdon Pen and other sites, we just don't see it as much, or it's hard to see from the material found. Papworth notes that the archaeology from the Iron Age is generally sparse in this area anyway. I mean, in contrast to Purbeck, where there's scatterings of small sites all over. So it's not clear how much Pilsdon Pen and the other forts nearby were really integrated into what would become the Durotrigian territory. We briefly observed that Pilsdon Pen bears a striking resemblance to Hembury over to the west, and I was relieved on reading further I'm not the only one to notice this. The parallels between the two and the dearth of material at Pilsdon coming from the east does suggest this area may have been more influenced from the west into what's now Devon. So heading north to Ham Hill, and this is over into Somerset now, we are rarely this far over. I do impulsively head to West Dorset now and then to maybe Abbotsbury or even beyond into Devon, but this far north and west is much more of a rarity for us. And just a remark in passing, if it feels like a long way for us now in the car, how much more would the distance be felt from one end of the territory at Hengistbury Head to the edge of Somerset? Now, Ham Hill is massive. The area we caught on our speedrun may have been a separate sort of annexed fortress to the north and west of the much wider site. Evidence keeps getting lost due to quarrying. I mean, even the Romans were quarrying here. However, the amount of archaeology done at Ham pales in comparison to our extensive and, thankfully, modern work undertaken at Cadbury. It's the pottery sequence at Cadbury that really unlocked our much more detailed understanding of Iron Age Dorset. It was a benchmark from which our dating from the rest of similar sites could be set. Well, occupation on the hill begins around 1000 BC. As you get into the early to middle Iron Age, the pottery you find in areas around the fort dries up almost completely, while occupation at the summit is intensifying. Similarly to Maiden Castle, we appear to be seeing a movement of people out of a broad pattern of settlement in the landscape and suddenly concentrated into these significant central sites. The earliest Bronze Age enclosure at Cadbury was rather slight, whereas the site we see today has layers of high banks and deep ditches. And yet, come the late Iron Age, you see people beginning to settle outside of the Hillfort again. And Cadbury has something we rarely find elsewhere. We have evidence of significant violence against the Hillfort. In the southwest gateway, a layer of burnt objects, including human remains, at least 22 individuals, men, women and children, were found. There's another mass burial nearby, but no dating evidence was recorded, so we can't say for certain if this was part of the same event. And while activity at Cadbury had been intense for the first part of the 1st century AD, there is a sudden lull for decades after. Roman barrack blocks were built in the centre of the fort. With all of this, it would be tempting, so tempting, to take this as a smoking gun, or, well, smoking gate, I guess, of the Roman conquest. Problem is, that would be stretching the dating evidence. It's possible, but we simply cannot narrow the dating that precisely. One suggestion is that Cadbury might have been a site of resistance during the Boudiccan Revolt. There seems to be a destructive event linked to the Romans in this area of Somerset that is not mirrored in other sites to the south in Dorset. Martin Papworth sums it up with the conjecture that the apparent difference of treatment by the Romans between the people of Dorset and Somerset may be between an enemy that was pacified and an ally that revolted. Well, heading southeast, there's no obvious answers why two massive hill forts such as Hambledon and Hod would be so close together. Hambledon appears to be the most ancient of the two, replete with not only a long barrow but several causewayed enclosures, and we have significant Neolithic activity on the site attested by finds like these. Hod, on the other hand, we've only found a single Bronze Age barrow within it, and this was flattened when the Romans were building their fort in the northwest corner. Hod may have been referenced by the classical writers, if it is in fact the Dunium referenced by Ptolemy, but we can't be sure. Now, there's been a fair quantity of archaeology done at Hod, but not all of it good. For example, it was excavated at various times in the mid-1800s by Henry Durden, but he was mainly interested in finds, not documenting them or the context in which they were found. Between 1951 and 1959, the site was being excavated by Ian Richmond, and one of his more striking interpretations concerns a cluster of ballista bolts found in a roundhouse larger than the others. Coupled with a find of an ornate spear near the doorway, he interpreted this with the rather operatic account of how this was the chief's hut, and the Romans had fired a barrage of ballista bolts at the hut, killing the chief, and since signs of conflict are absent from the rest of the hill forts, this must have been enough for the fort to surrender. Now, this has strong shades of Mortimer Wheeler's account, who himself was a major in the Royal Artillery and had described the, quote, artillery barrage against Maiden Castle with great flair, and it seems that Richmond is kind of picking up on this. Considering the likelihood that Hod was not densely populated when the Romans reached it, it's much more likely that these ballista bolts were the result of, target practice, not some show of force. Not least because if you visit, the first time I ever went to Hod Hill was on a summer's evening, and like many people, I had it on the map, but I hadn't quite figured out the parking sitch, so we ended up on a footpath way below on the southern side. There was farmers' fields between us and the fort with no apparent access, so I got some aerial footage, but that was it. The hut in question was in the southeastern quadrant of the fort, and the nearest high point to the south is something like a kilometre away. Now, I'm no ballista expert, but getting several projectiles to fly a kilometre and all hit a tight cluster on a specific target, otherwise, what are we suggesting? They built a 100-metre tall tower from down below? It's all a bit absurd. And deferring to Miles Russell a second, in the survey of Hod, he suggests that the designation of the hut as a chieftain's may be simply incorrect. And also, in a paper in 2019, Miles does question the conclusion of an artillery barrage and leans towards the possibility of target practice. Yeah, you see, this is one of the first twists you encounter in the story. We've been hinting at this already, but we've got all these pre-Roman sites across Britain. It's not hard to squint at them and go, okay then, so how's this going to stack up against the Roman army when they come through here, as we know they did? And you can be excused for making this mistake. It's based on a not unreasonable assumption, but at least as far as the south of Britain goes, the mental image of waves of legionaries crashing up against the wooden palisade walls of hill forts, this just moves further and further away from plausibility with every archaeological excavation we do in modern times. It may have happened in some places, but it's become an unsafe assumption that that is what AD 43 looked like everywhere. Goodness knows we'd like to know more. The written sources we have, Tacitus being our earliest source in his Life of Agricola, it's being written a generation later and it doesn't go into anywhere near the details we'd like. He describes 2 hostile tribes, and because it's in the same breath that he also references Vectis, the Isle of Wight to you and I, it sort of implies the hostile tribes he's referencing are nearby, but it's not completely clear. We mentioned Mortimer Wheeler already. He excavated a cemetery at the eastern gate of Maiden Castle and wrote with great excitement about how this, quote, war cemetery dated from the Roman, quote, attack on the fort. But further examination of the evidence makes this rather fall apart. I'd go into exactly how and why, but most excitingly, next episode, we're sitting down for a chat with Miles Russell, who just recently had a new paper out on this, so I'm going to get him to expand on it a little further. Anyway, we just have to reframe how we picture ancient Britain, where the pattern from the Hillforts we're seeing is that they were these intense centres of activity and power in the early and mid-Iron Age. From around 100 BC, people appear to be doing the opposite. Far from building increasingly defensive hill forts, they are spreading out and settling into other more lowland areas that are nowhere near as vigorously defended, if at all. Heading down to Badbury Rings, for example, the fort appears to be superseded by a large settlement we now call Crab Farm. This may be the site identified as Vindo Claudia in the Antonine itinerary. The Romans later built a fort right next door, so they seem to think it was an important strategic spot to control. But if that's the first twist, that by the time of the Roman conquest of Britain, a lot of hill forts had fallen out of use or drastically changed use, well, the second twist. We mentioned Ptolemy as this early source for Britain, naming the tribes, and we mentioned the various ways we've looked to corroborate this with the archaeology, things like coin finds, yes, all well and good. However, something I didn't realise until I was a few years into exploring hill forts, back projecting these tribal groupings way into the early Iron Age doesn't work. It's not just that it's an unsafe assumption or we're trying to tiptoe around and be really careful. You can just very clearly see it in the archaeology that the Durotriges were doing things very differently to the early Iron Age. So I don't have tons of footage, but at the excavations that Bournemouth University and the Durotriges project have been undertaking, this might surprise you, but we rarely find burials from the Iron Age in Britain. It varies between regions, but you can quickly see how this would be a problem for piecing together what's going on. If you're not familiar with the idea of excarnation, it's a concept that can take some getting used to. It kind of appears to fly in the face of everything we think about death and the treatment of the dead. Not just how we think about it, but how our ancestors thought about it too. We're accustomed to seeing these great burial monuments and people taking very great care over their dead. And so to come to a culture where the dead appear to be deliberately left out in the open to decompose and or be set upon by birds, try to resist the urge to assume, wow, what a bunch of degenerates. Excarnation is not as rare as you might think. It is found in other cultures around the world as well. If you look up the Towers of Silence and burial customs for Zoroastrians in Persia, for example. Anyway, Dorset is somewhat unique in that we have burials. And by the way, don't all jump in at once and be like, that's not a real skeleton. That's just a med school model of a skeleton. Fake news, conspiracy, someone call Alex Jones. Relax. These were placed here for the open days to give visitors an idea of what had been found and how. And what we see, Durotrigean burials are, for example, crouched. They are laid out in quite a particular way, quite different from the earlier Iron Age burials from around the site. You just see the change right there in the archaeology. And in case you're not aware, cultures rarely change deeply held beliefs just on a dime. You don't just suddenly one day decide that the manner in which you've been treating your dead, we're just going to do it completely differently now. Not without something drastic like societal stress or new influences coming from other populations with differing beliefs or practices, etc. So yes, the twist is that while we have this population in Dorset, a culture which we call the Durotriges, they are not the ones who built the hill forts.
You are not.
I know, don't all gasp at once. They may have continued to inhabit them, at least some of them, in various ways. But yes, if you divide the history of Britain into Neolithic, Bronze Age and Iron Age, you might think that the cultures within each broad time period are suitably homogenous, but no. Turns out that the late Iron Age is doing things very differently from the early and mid. It's worth pointing to developments on the continent. Even though this is long before the Romans would invade and even before Caesar had become an uninvited guest, trade with and movement from the continent is having a significant impact on what you may have assumed is the more insular Britain. Just a reminder that coinage is a late development in Iron Age Britain. The cultures of the early and middle Iron Age are not striking coins. Rather, you have things like these currency bars, people trading in commodities, and so on. So this makes it harder to tell the story to all of you. After going through who the Durotriges were and all sorts of details, turns out the real protagonists of this journey, the culture that actually built all the Hillforts we've been showing you, this is a culture for whom we don't have a name, we don't have coins to at least partially put a face to them. The Durotriges were at the very least a different cultural epoch. So what does that leave us with? Well, we can go over the Hillforts case by case. As you may have already seen, there's this narrative of significant places undergoing large-scale changes in the early to mid-Iron Age, whether it's the causewayed enclosures and long barrows of Hambledon being encircled by a multi-valley enclosure centuries later, or Maiden Castle developing from a Neolithic ritual site to a central hub in the area, or Hengistbury Head changing from a site with a history of use almost as long as humans had been in the area into an industrial centre of metalwork and shipping. To try and answer all of this better, and look, this may not be quite the clarity that people were hoping for, it's actually going to help us if we look at the history of how we've understood the different time periods and change within the British Iron Age, particularly focusing in the south. So, in the 20th century, if we start in 1931, Professor Christopher Hawkes wrote an article simply titled Hillforts, 2 words, and in it he proposed a new model for dating the Iron Age in Britain. Previously, sites had been matched with the cultures on the continent, known as the Hallstatt, this is 800 to 400 BC, La Tène from 400 to 100 BC, and a final Belgic category. This final category relates to the references that Julius Caesar made in his writings about an invading culture that came across the Channel that, quote, came to plunder and make war, nearly all of them retaining the names of the tribes from which they originated and later settled down to till the soil. So you can find stylistic links to the material of these groups for sure, but it just provided an inadequate model for what was going on in Britain, which is suitably separate from activity on the continent. Therefore, the new model proposed was simply label these phases A, B, and C. But the key thing to note here is that societal change in Britain, Hawkes still argued, was the result of waves of movement from the continent, and this is the approach that Mortimer Wheeler used, for example. Essentially that in 600-ish BC, a wave of conquests from Europe caused the Hillforts to be built in the first place. That was A. Then 400 BC, another wave, this time from Brittany and Spain, caused changes in Hillfort design, and, for example, Wheeler attributed this B group as the builders of Maiden Castle. And then yes, Group C, from around 75 BC, Belgic invaders from the continent landing in both Kent and the Solent and then spreading out, and this is what caused the other changes where the Hillforts are being abandoned. However, this ABC model has also been revised. In 1964, Frank Hodson put forward that this model of continental invasions was just not suitable, and in fact, what we were seeing was indigenous cultural development with some but limited influence from outside. So yet there's more of a move towards the model that, far from the change in Britain being primarily motivated by the ingress of invaders, bringing in these new ideas that we see as changes in cultural expression that show up in the archaeology, that yes, these are more indigenous developments. And also into the 1960s and 70s, the excavations done at Cadbury gave us this particularly complete pottery sequence from the different layers. It was suitably rich that we could compare it to pottery from other sites and corroborate the dating altogether. So the when in the Iron Age we've been able to bring into sharper focus, but the who, and most elusive of all, the why, is still an open question. It's far from certain. Again, this is why I mentioned up top, you can't expect or demand that a clear, one-dimensional answer be handed you for every question we have about ancient history. If you insist on that, you will in all likelihood just settle on the first model that roughly fits with the ideas you already had, even if it means quietly excluding the other data points that contradict your model. The model we currently use for the Iron Age in southern Britain is thus. We've got the early Iron Age from about 800 to around 300 BC, the Middle Iron Age from about 300 to 100 BC, the Late Iron Age 100 BC to 43 AD, and you can also add a category at either end. You can have a Latest Bronze Age / Earliest Iron Age from about 900 to 700 BC, and you can also add on a Latest Iron Age, mostly to define the large-scale changes happening in the 1st century AD. Yeah, there's a bit of overlap. I've seen different numbers batted around for the early and mid, but you get the gist. And look, if we try and answer the why get highly defensive in the early and mid Iron Age only to later decide, actually it's cool, we don't need vast triple banks around our settlements. You want to throw in some conjecture, probably relating to violence or strength, then yeah, believe me too. I mean, it certainly seems that the culture in the late Iron Age is more at ease with itself. Maybe within the Durotrigian sphere, it was suitably peaceful, at least in the interior, that you just didn't need to fortify yourself. There weren't any external threats raiding, miles and miles into Durotrigian territory. Maybe, but, we still don't know. Our evidence for specific episodes of violence in the Iron Age is really lacking. Our ability to associate a particular skeleton showing a violent death with a specific conflict is notoriously difficult, and the impulse to do so is, for example, what led Mortimer Wheeler to write with great flair about his Maiden Castle war cemetery, which later turned out to be, well, certainly not what he was describing. I wonder if this might be a slightly disappointing coda to the story. I will admit the slight flaw with this series. People actually in archaeology will have spotted this right away, but Hillforts are an unusual holdover from the Iron Age because in a great many cases they are pretty obvious, or very obvious, in the landscape. But most Iron Age archaeology in Britain, from which we've derived much of the most important information about the period, is not like that. There is usually precious little above ground that the average person, myself included, would be able to see at a cursory glance. So while this journey began by exploring Hillforts, and wow, isn't this cool? You can see this footprint of ancient Britain. If you go any deeper into the topic, very quickly you are dealing with sites and data that is not available for you just to wander into the countryside and see. Now look, hey, it makes perfect sense to be interested in Hillforts and enjoy visiting them and photographing them, and that being a gateway into an interest in British prehistory. That's kind of what happened with us. You just have to be aware that sites that are visible above ground, that is a massive sampling bias. It's fine, it's not a big deal, just as long as you've understood that. Now, with that sampling bias, and based on what we've understood about the changes in southern Britain, Dorset in specific, you soon realise that the monuments we have, surviving clearly and observably for the general public to visit, are primarily from the early and mid-Iron Age. Duropolis, currently being excavated by the Durotriges project, may represent where the population of Maiden Castle moved to. Opida in general may have had fortifying banks and ditches, but it's not perhaps what we're used to with Hillforts. I mean, taking the Chichester entrenchments, for example, not great to show on camera, but if we look at a map of what we know, they seem to have more in common with the dykes we see across northern Dorset. Not really the sort of enveloping systems we're used to with Hillforts, and of course much of it is just buried beneath the town of Chichester now. Or there's Silchester. This was a major oppidum of the Atrebates. The Romans would build there, naming it Caleva Atrebatum. And while the Roman walls there are very impressive, and it represents one of the few major Roman towns that didn't remain a population centre into the medieval and then modern times, the remains of the oppidum here are, well, apparently you can make out a bank if you're prepared to dive into the hedges a bit, but again, based on what survived for us to see or visit now, Oppida just tend to be pretty disappointing as day trips. Probably the best example of one that you can see is Stannick, much further to the north. So Oppida are great for archaeology, but it turns out to be this fluke of survival bias that the early antecedents from the early and mid-Iron Age survive much better than the large settlements that would come to dominate the British landscape before the Roman conquest. If we understand this, and I'm saying we to mean us, comparative amateurs who haven't studied the archaeological record intensively, we may finally have got a better picture of how the British Iron Age fits together, complete with all the missing pieces that we'd like to fill in one day. I didn't even get around to mentioning the third twist. If twist 1 was that many Hillforts were either not occupied or not especially prominent when the Romans arrived, and twist 2 was that the culture that built these was not the Durotriges but an unnamed Iron Age culture, well, the third twist is that the Durotriges may not have existed, at least not in the form that we thought. Now, this is a point of contention. You can argue it either way. The main evidence we have for the existence of the Durotriges are Ptolemy's writings, 2 inscriptions from Roman Britain, coinage, and the unified type of pottery we mentioned. Now, That's not an insignificant body of evidence, but you can counter this by looking at the variations between the different areas of Dorset. I mean, we mentioned on our journey that no two of these hill forts really look anything alike. They all seem to have been designed very differently, and while, yeah, some of that would have been, tracing the contours of the hill you're building on, there still doesn't seem to be one unifying design ideal that connects all of them together. Martin Papworth in his book is sort of leaning on this as a possibility that Durotriges works for us as a term of convenience, but it's very plausible that in conversation with someone in the 1st century BC, they may not have understood the term or the idea of Durotriges at all. That just may not have been how they saw their world. And it's certainly a useful balancing notion that the bonds between the different communities across Dorset may have varied. Their willingness or enthusiasm for saluting the flag in any way is highly questionable. The degree to which they felt unified is difficult to quantify. For me, I think the term Durotriges does represent a good model to represent the people occupying Dorset, as opposed to the groups to the west, heading into Devon and Cornwall, and then north and east with the Dabuni and the Atrebates respectively. But it is a reminder that the more nuance you add, the more strain it puts on the models that you're using to explain the past neatly. The groupings in southern Britain were in some degree of flux. In terms of how much, Papworth points out that Caesar names 5 tribes from his visit in 55 and 54 BC. This is obviously over in Kent, but we never hear about these groups again. Caesar remarks that his arrival was enough to galvanise several groups to band together, and even though the Roman force he commanded wasn't in Britain all that long, it's more than enough to destabilise the balance of power in that region, with alliances changing, previous, perhaps smaller groups dissolving into larger confederacies to avoid annihilation. It's possible, and as far as Dorset, the question hinges on how much regional control did the communities living somewhere like Ham Hill or Hod or elsewhere have, and how did this change over time? Was cooperation over the Dorset area begrudging and piecemeal, or did these groups really see themselves as a unified, united whole? These are questions of attitude, questions that archaeology is much less well equipped to answer, but I hope that this has given you much more insight into the area and the period. You will notice that more insight really just means asking 100 new questions. So yes, next episode we'll be sitting down with Miles Russell, and with all the nested concepts within this, things I looked at and were like, I'm going to really butcher that if I try and categorise it in my own words. Well, those, we're going to get Miles to unpack them a little bit better. Anyway, the other order of business we have, and as promised, yes, we're going to just briefly catch up on some of the Dorset hill forts that we didn't catch in the last 2 episodes. So, in no particular order, the one that might have irked people the most, the book we're citing in this series has a pretty incredible shot of it. This is Flowers Barrow. It's inside an active military firing range, so no aerial photography for us unless you've got, plane money, I guess. Hey, bandcam.com. Support us by buying the EP. Anyway, I could more than happily just flash up all the landscape shots I've captured from here. This is probably one of the absolute highlights of the Jurassic Coast. With that in mind, the ramparts are admittedly somewhat harder to capture quite as compellingly from the ground. As you can see from any plan of the site, it is gradually crumbling down this cliff face here. It's believed we might have lost about a third of the internal area already, but it's got some solid ditches around its perimeter and we can enjoy it while it lasts. And while we're at this vantage point, I'm not going to discuss this at length, but the short version, I can understand the impulse behind the question, what's the largest hill fort in Britain? Now, relatable, yeah, but I'm here to tell you it's simply not a very good question. People often point to Maiden Castle, and by area, at least, that's incorrect. Maiden Castle probably deserves the more vague trophy for being the most impressive large hill fort. Multiply sheer area by number and depth and quality of the banks. A common answer is Stannick, but we're going to get to that in a later episode. A quick glance will demonstrate that Maiden Castle, it most certainly is not. It's more of an oppidum. It's not really comparing like with like. We've mentioned Oppida, and essentially that's what makes a mess of this. These are Iron Age settlements, and with some ditches and banks cut around them, but simply put, they are as different as a medieval English castle is from a medieval English walled city. Making size comparisons between them in square footage is essentially meaningless. And with that in mind, opposite Flowers Barrow, there's actually another contender, Bindon Hill. There you go. Like that, you see the huge ramparts? Well, no, of course you don't. If we're a bit more selective with our shots, you can maybe make out the faint line of a ditch. Up close you can perceive a ditch, but only if you know exactly where to look, otherwise it just doesn't jump out as anything exceptional. Outside the firing range, close to the village of Lulworth, I can show you a bit more of an aerial perspective, so yeah, you can see why largest hill fort is not really a good measure of a site's importance. 110 hectares Bindon Hill may be, but lacking any evidence for settlement within it, the thought of defending like a 2-kilometre long wall, forget it. This has to be some sort of livestock enclosure, probably little more. So heading east and inland a bit further, and this, a little way from Wareham, is Woolsbarrow Hill. You can probably see these scorch marks. This is from the first time we ever visited, and there'd just been a fire there, but it kind of cleared off some of the foliage, such that the ramparts are much more readily visible. Yet, to be honest, it's not the most easily discernible hill fort in the landscape, don't mind conceding that, but the ditches to the north are definitely more prominent. Northwest of Woolsbarrow, this is Woodbury Hill. Must admit, I'd not clocked this until recently. The area is mostly occupied by a paintball range, but yeah, the outer ramparts are pretty apparent. Was filming this on an unusually windy day, so couldn't get up too high. And then a short way to the west, Wetherby Castle. Now, not 100% sure about access for this one. When I went, it appears not, at least, not on foot. Might be mistaken, it sort of depends on your attitude to jumping barbed wire, I guess. This is a pretty impressive one if you can get above it, mostly tree covered, yeah, but you can still make out the line of banks quite clearly. We had mentioned what appears to be a line of forts heading from Hengistbury, and the very next of these, before you get to Badbury, would actually be Dudsbury, but other than the considerable tree cover and also being a stone's throw from an international airport, those both make it much harder for us to see the form of the site. And yeah, I was a little unclear on access. It's both a girl guiding campsite, but there is also a clearly labelled public footpath. So these are the ramparts. They are far from clear on camera. Eventually, you get out from beneath the trees, and there's a rather helpful info board with a painting to help you understand the site. You are actually higher up than you realise. The trees just kind of mask it. But yeah, with the constraints mentioned and being very careful not to film anything around the Girl Guide camp, that's about all you can meaningfully get at Dudsbury. Switching to the western extremity of the area we've been examining, I'll admit, every so often you look at a particular hill and wonder, how come that didn't become a major hill fort? The Golden Cap is the highest point on the south coast. It's an unbelievable walk on a sunny day, or not. It's one of Dorset's absolute finest, and yet not a hill fort. It's high, but it's not exactly K2. But yeah, other than some barrows at the summit, nowadays only faintly visible, yeah, no dice. We're pretty far over to the west at this point. The Devon border is not far over there. And of course, there is a whole other world of hill forts around there, but we'll be getting out of Durotrigean territory for that, and we need to keep these videos organised somehow. So heading to the northern extent of Dorset, just a few loose ends. One that I caught super last minute in the area of Cranbourne Chase, just near Blandford. The Gussage Down area, I still don't know if I'm saying that right, is overflowing with ancient sites as it is, but amongst the various barrows, you can catch the ditches that delineate part of a settlement here. Now, I was filming this just a few days ago in time for this episode, but looking into it further, there is either it's a separate settlement or part of the same settlement just a little further south around the village of Gussage All Saints, though the edge of the village appears to partly overlay it, so it's not as easy to see. I haven't entirely cracked what's going on with this whole area, but here it is nonetheless. And not far to the north, I mentioned right at the beginning of the tour of Dorset that the boundaries of Dorset mirror the territory of the Durotriges. Well, to the northern extent, for a brief period they are in fact one and the same. We know this because while not a hill fort per se, the ditches of Bockley still today mark the exact border between Dorset and Wiltshire. This is an impressive site, one at which I've not been able to spend much time. We made it here on an icy morning in January and it looked gorgeous in the winter sun. There's quite a lot going on here archaeologically, as there's not only this rectilinear enclosure to the east, that's the Martin Down enclosure, which is such a good example of a small farmstead. It actually gives its name to the typology of sites like it. But there's also some World War II earthworks dug here as part of training exercises that, well, kind of throw you off the scent, but unmistakably and snaking off for miles, the Bockley ditches. And if we head further to the west, just short of Shaftesbury, in fact you have great views over it, draped across the hills around Melbury Beacon, a series of earthworks is clearly visible. Now, this doesn't neatly loop around to form a hill fort enclosure, rather the ditches snake in lines for a kilometre and cross each other. Dating is unclear. Both Historic England and this paper suggest that based on comparisons with Wiltshire, these do resemble prehistoric structures but could also potentially be later Roman work. Well, in the various drafts I was writing this episode, I could just feel the scope of it galloping away from me, in much the same way I was all blasé in the first 2 episodes, don't worry about it, we'll just fill in the context in the 3rd episode. Well, I suppose in some ways I've outsourced all the hardest questions to Miles, so there's still more for us to discover about Iron Age Dorset, and next episode we can try and unpick some of the harder questions. Meanwhile, Martin Papworth's book has been our Bible for this. It's a great comprehensive summary of the evidence. That's definitely a place to go if you want to dive into the details. And yes, bandcamp.com. We don't have a Patreon right now, but you can support us by buying our music there, or you can just stream it. That's cool too. And I'm sure you know all the YouTube-based ways you can help us out. I mean, you've stuck around to the end, so we really appreciate that. Otherwise, follow us on Blue Sky for more Hillforts and all sorts, and we'll be back with Miles Russell very soon.